My name is Taylor Lopez, and at 32, I thought I'd seen everything a charge nurse could encounter at Mica Mountain Hospital in Sparkle Ridge, New Mexico. The high desert facility served a sprawling rural community, and our medical surgical unit operated like a well-oiled machine, or so I believed until the autumn of 2023. The first sign something was wrong came during a routine staff meeting in October. Our unit director, Wesley Martinez, introduced our new contract nurse with unusual enthusiasm. Diana Chen will be with us for the next 6 months, he announced, gesturing toward a polished woman in her 40s, whose smile seemed practiced. She comes highly recommended and will serve as our liaison between the unit and hospital administration. Diana's credentials were impressive: 15 years of experience, certifications in multiple specialties, and glowing references from 3 major hospital systems. She integrated seamlessly into our 12-bed unit, quickly earning trust from both staff and patients. Her knowledge of hospital protocols was encyclopedic, and she had an uncanny ability to navigate administrative red tape that had frustrated our team for months. Within weeks, Diana had streamlined our documentation processes and somehow expedited approvals for treatments that typically took days. Patient satisfaction scores improved dramatically. Even our most skeptical physicians praised her efficiency. "She's a miracle worker," Dr. Chloe Rodriguez told me one evening. "I've never seen consent forms processed so quickly." That comment should have raised flags, but I was too grateful for the smoother operations to question the methods. Our unit had been struggling with administrative bottlenecks for over a year, and Diana's arrival felt like divine intervention. The subtle changes began in November. Diana started arriving early and staying late, often working alone in the medication room or at the nurse's station computer terminals. She volunteered for weekend shifts and holiday coverage, claiming she preferred the quieter pace. Her dedication seemed admirable, but something about her constant presence felt calculated. I noticed she had developed particularly close relationships with our most vulnerable patients, elderly individuals with complex medical histories and limited family involvement. Diana would spend extended periods in their rooms, emerging with signed consent forms for additional procedures or treatment modifications. When I complimented her patient rapport, she deflected with professional modesty. "It's just about taking time to explain things properly," she'd say, but her eyes never quite met mine during these conversations. The Epic electronic health record system began showing irregularities I couldn't initially identify. Timestamps on documentation seemed inconsistent, and certain entries appeared to have been modified after initial submission. When I mentioned these discrepancies to our IT support, they assured me the system was functioning normally. Diana's influence extended beyond our unit. She attended administrative meetings I'd never been invited to and seemed to have direct access to department heads who rarely visited our floor. Her badge access logs showed she was entering restricted areas during off hours, but when questioned, she explained she was conducting quality improvement research for administration. By December, the unease had settled deep in my chest like a persistent cough. Diana's efficiency was undeniable, but the methods remained opaque. Patients were consenting to procedures with unusual frequency, and their families seemed surprisingly uninformed about treatment plans. When I attempted to review consent documentation more carefully, I discovered that many files had been digitally archived in systems I couldn't access. The breaking point came during a quiet night shift in early January. I was completing my rounds when I noticed Diana's computer terminal was still logged in, displaying a patient consent form I'd never seen before. The signature looked fresh, but the timestamp indicated it had been completed hours earlier when that particular patient had been sedated for a procedure. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, understanding finally crystallizing. The efficiency, the streamlined processes, the improved metrics. Everything had come at a cost I was only beginning to comprehend. The silence of the night shift suddenly felt ominous, and I realized that the trust I'd placed in Diana Chen might have been the biggest mistake of my career. The discovery of that consent form on Diana's terminal marked the beginning of my investigation into what I'd initially dismissed as administrative efficiency. Over the following weeks, I began documenting patterns that had previously seemed like improvements to our unit's operations. Diana Chen had arrived at Mica Mountain Hospital 6 months earlier as part of a contract nursing program designed to address our staffing shortages. Her credentials were impeccable. 15 years of experience in critical care, certifications in advanced cardiac life support, and glowing recommendations from 3 previous assignments. More importantly, she'd been designated as the liaison between our unit and hospital administration, a role that gave her unprecedented access to both patient care decisions and administrative protocols. From her first week, Diana had impressed everyone with her ability to streamline processes that had previously caused delays. Patient consent procedures that typically required multiple conversations and careful documentation were suddenly completed with remarkable efficiency. Families who had previously asked numerous questions about treatment plans seemed satisfied after brief consultations. Our unit's metrics improved dramatically. Patient satisfaction scores increased, length of stay decreased, and administrative complaints virtually disappeared. Diana has revolutionized our approach to patient communication, Dr. Wesley Martinez, our unit director, had announced during a staff meeting in October. Her method should be studied and implemented hospital-wide. I'd initially attributed Diana's success to her experience and communication skills. She had a way of explaining complex medical procedures in terms that seemed to immediately reassure patients and families. Her documentation was thorough, her timing impeccable, and her ability to coordinate between different departments was unmatched. But as I began paying closer attention, inconsistencies emerged that troubled me. Patients who had initially expressed concerns about proposed treatments would suddenly become enthusiastic advocates for procedures they'd previously questioned. Families who had requested second opinions would withdraw their requests after private consultations with Diana. The transformation was remarkable, but the speed of these changes began to feel unnatural. I started reviewing consent documentation more systematically, comparing Diana's cases with those handled by other nurses. The differences were subtle but significant. Diana's consent forms were consistently completed faster, with fewer questions documented from patients or families. Her notes indicated comprehensive discussions, but the actual content of these conversations was rarely detailed beyond standard template language. The Epic system showed that Diana frequently accessed patient records during off hours, often making modifications to existing documentation. When I questioned her about these late-night entries, she explained that she was updating records with information gathered during follow-up conversations with families. Patients often think of questions after our initial discussions, she'd explain. I make sure to document everything thoroughly to maintain continuity of care. Her explanations were reasonable, but something about her tone suggested rehearsed responses rather than spontaneous clarification. Diana's badge access logs revealed she was entering patient rooms during shift changes when other staff members were occupied with handoff procedures. She also had access to administrative areas that most nurses couldn't enter, including the medical records department and the billing office. In late January, I decided to observe Diana's patient interactions more closely. During a particularly busy afternoon, I positioned myself where I could monitor her consultation with the Rodriguez family regarding their father's upcoming cardiac procedure. The family had previously expressed significant concerns about the risks and had requested time to consider their options. Diana's conversation with them lasted approximately 15 minutes. From my position, I could see her showing them documents and pointing to specific sections, but I couldn't hear the details of their discussion. When she emerged from the room, the family appeared calm and satisfied. Within an hour, they had signed comprehensive consent forms for not only the originally proposed procedure, but also for several additional interventions that hadn't been part of the initial treatment plan. I approached Mrs. Rodriguez later that evening to check on their understanding of the procedures. Her responses revealed significant gaps in her comprehension of what they had actually consented to. She believed they had agreed to a single, minimally invasive procedure, but the documentation indicated consent for multiple interventions with varying degrees of complexity and risk. The nurse explained everything so clearly, Mrs. Rodriguez told me. She said the doctors recommended these additional procedures to ensure the best outcome, and that most families choose this comprehensive approach. She showed us statistics about success rates, and said we could trust the medical team completely. When I reviewed the consent forms Diana had obtained, I discovered they included authorization for procedures that hadn't been discussed with the attending physician. The documentation suggested comprehensive medical consultations that hadn't actually occurred. Most concerning, the forms included consent for experimental treatments that required special approval protocols Diana couldn't have legitimately obtained. I began tracking similar patterns across Diana's other cases. patients consistently consented to more extensive treatments than originally proposed. Families who had initially sought second opinions invariably decided to proceed with treatments at Mica Mountain Hospital. The consent documentation was thorough, but the actual medical justification for many of the additional procedures was questionable. My investigation revealed that Diana had developed relationships with specific physicians who seemed unusually willing to approve expanded treatment plans. Dr. Wesley Fernandez from cardiology and Dr. Chloe Morrison from oncology frequently appeared on treatment orders that originated from Diana's patient consultations. Both physicians had seen significant increases in their procedure volumes since Diana's arrival. The financial implications became clear when I accessed billing records through my administrative privileges. Patients who had initially been scheduled for routine procedures were generating significantly higher revenue after Diana's consultations. The additional treatments she was obtaining consent for were typically more expensive and often involved newer technologies that carried higher reimbursement rates. I discovered that Diana had been attending monthly meetings with the hospital's Revenue Optimization Committee, a group I'd never heard of before her arrival. Her role in these meetings was described as patient advocacy and treatment coordination, but the timing of these sessions coincided with increases in high-value procedure authorizations. The most disturbing discovery came when I found consent forms that had been backdated to appear as though they had been signed before procedures that had already been completed. The electronic signatures showed timestamp inconsistencies that suggested they had been obtained after patients had already undergone treatments. In some cases, patients had been sedated or under anesthesia when the consent forms indicated they had provided informed authorization. By early February, I had documented at least 12 cases where Diana had obtained consent for procedures that exceeded the scope of what patients had originally agreed to discuss. The pattern was consistent. Initial consultations led to expanded treatment recommendations, families were presented with compelling statistical evidence, and comprehensive consent was obtained for multiple procedures that generated substantial additional revenue. I realized that Diana's efficiency hadn't come from superior communication skills or administrative expertise. She had been systematically bypassing proper patient consent procedures, manipulating families into authorizing treatments they didn't fully understand, and collaborating with physicians who were willing to perform unnecessary procedures for financial gain. The weight of this discovery settled over me like a heavy blanket. Diana Chen, the colleague I'd trusted and admired, had been exploiting vulnerable patients and their families for months. Her role as liaison between our unit and administration had provided the perfect cover for a sophisticated scheme that violated every principle of medical ethics I'd sworn to uphold. As I sat in my car after that February night shift, staring at the evidence I'd compiled, I knew that confronting this betrayal would require more courage than I'd ever needed in my medical career. Diana's influence extended throughout the hospital, and challenging her would mean challenging the very administrators who had praised her innovations. But the faces of the patients and families who had trusted us haunted me, and I knew that my silence would make me complicit in their exploitation. The next morning, I arrived at Mica Mountain Hospital with a manila folder containing copies of all the documentation I'd gathered. My hands trembled slightly as I badged into the administrative wing, knowing that what I was about to do would irrevocably change everything. I had scheduled a meeting with Dr. Wesley Martinez, our chief medical officer, under the pretense of discussing quality improvement initiatives. Dr. Martinez had always maintained an open-door policy, and his reputation for ethical leadership was well established throughout Sparkle Ridge's medical community. "Taylor, good to see you," Dr. Martinez said as I entered his office. "You mentioned some concerns about our consent procedures." I placed the folder on his desk, my voice steady despite the gravity of what I was revealing. "Dr. Martinez, I've discovered a pattern of consent irregularities that I believe requires immediate investigation." As I walked him through the documentation, I watched his expression shift from mild interest to serious concern and finally to barely contained alarm. The timestamp discrepancies, the pattern of expanded procedures, the correlation between Diana's involvement and increased revenue generation, it all painted a picture that no ethical physician could ignore. "These are serious allegations, Taylor," Dr. Martinez said, closing the folder. "You understand that if this is accurate, we're looking at potential violations of federal regulations, not just hospital policy." "I understand completely." That's why I felt I had to bring this to your attention. Dr. Martinez leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. I need to involve our compliance department immediately. This will require a formal investigation, and I want you to know that there may be significant pushback. Diana has strong relationships throughout the administration. Within hours, the hospital's compliance team had initiated a preliminary review. I was interviewed by Chloe Rodriguez, our chief compliance officer, who took detailed notes as I explained my findings. The investigation would be conducted quietly to preserve the integrity of the evidence and protect ongoing patient care. But word travels fast in a hospital environment, and by the end of the week I could sense the shift in atmosphere. Diana's usual confident demeanor seemed strained, and I noticed her having hushed conversations with several department heads. She hadn't approached me directly, but I felt her watching me during our shifts. The breakthrough came when Wesley Thompson, a respiratory therapist who had worked closely with Diana on several cases, approached me during a quiet moment in the break room. Taylor, I heard there might be some questions about consent procedures, Wesley said, glancing around to ensure we were alone. I've been wondering about some things myself. Wesley revealed that he had noticed Diana coaching families through consent discussions in ways that seemed to minimize risks and emphasize benefits disproportionately. He had documentation of several cases where patients had expressed confusion about procedures they had supposedly agreed to undergo. I kept notes because something felt off, Wesley explained. Diana would tell families that certain procedures were, quote, routine follow-ups to treatments they'd already consented to, but the procedures were actually separate interventions requiring independent authorization. Wesley's testimony provided crucial corroboration for my findings. Together, we met with the compliance team and provided a comprehensive picture of Diana's systematic manipulation of the consent process. The formal investigation expanded rapidly. External auditors were brought in to review billing records, and patient advocates began conducting follow-up interviews with affected families. The scope of Diana's misconduct became increasingly clear as investigators uncovered a network of complicit physicians who had benefited from the increased procedure volume. 3 weeks into the investigation, Diana was placed on administrative leave pending the completion of the review. The announcement was made quietly, with minimal disruption to patient care, but the impact on staff morale was significant. Many colleagues who had admired Diana's efficiency were struggling to reconcile their positive impressions with the emerging evidence of her misconduct. I found myself in an uncomfortable position as word spread that I had initiated the investigation. Some colleagues expressed support for my actions, recognizing the importance of protecting patient rights. Others seemed to view me as a troublemaker who had disrupted a successful program. The pressure intensified when I received a call from hospital administration requesting a meeting. I entered the conference room to find Diana's supervisor, along with 2 other department heads waiting for me. Taylor, we understand you've raised some concerns about our consent procedures, one of them began. We want to ensure that any misunderstandings are clarified before the situation escalates unnecessarily. The tone of the meeting was politely threatening. They suggested that my interpretation of the documentation might be overly rigid, that Diana's innovations had improved patient satisfaction scores, and that a more collaborative approach to resolving concerns might be beneficial for everyone involved. We value your dedication to quality care, they continued, but we also need to consider the broader impact of these allegations on our hospital's reputation and the morale of our staff. I maintained my composure, reiterating that my concerns were based on documented evidence of consent irregularities that violated established protocols. I emphasized that my obligation was to patient safety and ethical standards, not to protecting any individual's reputation or the hospital's financial interests. The meeting ended without resolution, but the message was clear. The administration was hoping I would reconsider my position and allow the matter to be handled internally without external scrutiny. That evening, Wesley Thompson called me at home. Taylor, I wanted you to know that I've been approached by several people suggesting that I might have misunderstood what I witnessed. There's definitely pressure building to minimize this situation. Despite the mounting pressure, the external investigation continued. Federal regulators became involved when the scope of the billing irregularities became apparent. The hospital faced potential sanctions and significant financial penalties if the allegations were substantiated. 4 weeks after I had first approached Dr. Martinez, the investigation concluded. Diana Chen was terminated for violations of patient consent protocols, billing fraud, and professional misconduct. 3 physicians who had participated in the scheme were also dismissed, and the hospital implemented comprehensive reforms to prevent similar violations. The resolution brought a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The investigation had consumed months of my life and created significant stress within our workplace. But as I reviewed the final report, which documented how our actions had protected dozens of patients from unnecessary procedures and financial exploitation, I knew that the difficult path had been necessary. Dr. Martinez called me into his office one final time. "Taylor, I want you to know that your courage in bringing this forward has prevented significant harm to our patients and our institution. The board has asked me to express their gratitude for your commitment to ethical standards." The silence that followed felt different from the tense quiet that had pervaded the hospital during the investigation. This was the silence of resolution, of justice served, and of a workplace beginning to heal from a profound betrayal of trust.